What would you do if your entire life turned out to be a lie? If the person you loved most harbored a secret so dark it could tear apart everything you believed in? Sometimes the truth is far more dangerous than the lie. Emma sat in the quiet, her mind racing. The house felt empty, too large, too still. She was alone again, just as she had been for weeks now. Jonathan, her husband, was always away, attending meetings or working late at the church. And yet, every night, when he returned, something was missing. Something felt wrong. It wasn't always this way. Emma and Jonathan had been the perfect couple once. They had built their life together on a foundation of love, trust, and faith. At least, that's what Emma had always believed. But lately, doubt had crept in. It started small, just whispers in the back of her mind, things she could easily brush aside. But the whispers grew louder with each passing day until they became a roar she couldn't ignore. The first crack had appeared on their wedding night. After years of waiting, of promises and whispered assurances that they would finally be together in every sense, something had changed. Emma had been nervous, her heart pounding with anticipation, but Jonathan had been distant, cold. His touch had been light, like he was afraid to get too close, to truly connect. He had kissed her forehead gently and told her to be patient, that their time would come. They had waited this long, he said. What was another night? Emma had trusted him. She had wanted to believe that everything would be perfect once they were settled into their new life. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, that distance between them grew. Every night was the same. Jonathan would pour her a glass of wine, they would talk, laugh. But the closeness she longed for never came. And every night, Emma would wake up the next morning with the same vague, unsettling feeling, sore, groggy, her memories clouded. At first, she had dismissed it, telling herself it was just stress, the demands of Jonathan's work as a pastor, the pressures of being a newlywed. But it wasn't long before she began to wonder if something more sinister was at play. The last time she had brought it up, Jonathan had smiled, that same soft, calm smile that always put her at ease, and told her not to worry. "We're taking it slow," he had said, his voice so gentle, so reassuring. But the words felt hollow now. Something in his eyes wasn't right. The kindness that used to make her heart flutter now only made her feel cold inside. And then there were the nights she couldn't remember, nights where she was sure they had been together, and yet the next morning it was as if nothing had happened. Jonathan would leave early for the church, and Emma would be left alone with her thoughts, her doubts. Why couldn't she remember? Why did she always feel so off? It was a creeping suspicion, one she had tried to push away, to bury deep inside. But it grew, gnawing at her until she could no longer ignore it. Jonathan was hiding something from her. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel it, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. Something dark, something that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. And so Emma made a decision. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She needed to understand what was happening to her, what was happening in her marriage. The next morning, while Jonathan was out, she bought a small hidden camera, the kind no one would notice. She installed it in their bedroom, tucked discreetly out of view. She didn't tell him. She couldn't. Whatever this was, it was bigger than she could handle alone. If Jonathan had secrets, Emma was going to uncover them. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day felt like an eternity. Every glance from Jonathan weighed with suspicion. He was still the same man she had married, or at least he looked the same. But now, every word he said felt like a lie. Emma was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, unsure of what to believe, unsure of who to trust. And then, the moment came. One night, after another drink, another evening of forced smiles and half-hearted reassurances, Emma felt the same familiar fog descend over her. She tried to stay awake, tried to fight the drowsiness that pulled at her, but it was no use. The world faded to black. When she woke the next morning, her body ached, and her mind felt foggy as usual. But this time, she had the footage. Her hands trembled as she reached for the camera, her heart pounding in her chest. She pressed play, bracing herself for whatever truth was about to be revealed, and what she saw shattered her world. The room was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made Emma's heart pound in her chest. She sat there frozen, staring at the small screen in her hands, her fingers trembling. She could barely breathe as she pressed play, the weight of her suspicions crashing down on her. She wasn't sure what she would see, but part of her already knew it wouldn't be good. Deep down, she had known for a while that her life wasn't what it seemed. The footage began innocently enough. There was Jonathan, just as she expected, moving about the bedroom after they had said goodnight. He was calm, methodical, like he had done this 100 times before. He glanced toward her, lying unconscious on the bed, her body limp, unmoving. Emma watched in disbelief as he poured something into a glass, a drink, the same drink he had handed her before she blacked out. Her heart sank. It wasn't just exhaustion or stress causing her to black out each night. Jonathan had been drugging her. The man she had trusted more than anyone, the man she had married, was drugging her every single night. The betrayal hit her like a freight train, but that wasn't the worst of it. As she continued to watch, the door to their bedroom creaked open, and a figure entered. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped into the room. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a stranger. He was someone she had never seen before. He wasn't from their neighborhood, and certainly not from the church where Jonathan was a pastor. Emma's stomach twisted as the man approached her unconscious body, his movements disturbingly casual. Jonathan stood by the door, watching, no, not watching, allowing. He stood there, complicit, as the man touched her, violated her, all while Emma lay there, unaware of the nightmare unfolding. Every nerve in Emma's body screamed, but she was paralyzed, unable to tear her eyes from the screen. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined. This wasn't just an affair. This was a violation of everything she held sacred. Everything she believed about love, trust, and her own marriage. Jonathan wasn't just deceiving her, he was destroying her, piece by piece, with every lie, every action he allowed in that room. The footage felt endless, a grotesque reel of the life she thought she knew unraveling before her. When it finally ended, Emma sat in stunned silence, the gravity of what she had witnessed settling over her like a suffocating weight. Her mind raced, trying to process the impossible. Her husband, this man she had built her life with, had orchestrated every horrifying moment. She couldn't understand it. Why? Why had Jonathan done this? What kind of person was he really? The man she had loved, the man she had promised to spend her life with, was a monster. And the man in the footage, the one Jonathan had invited into their bedroom, wasn't just anyone. He was someone far more dangerous. He was Jonathan's ex-lover. The revelation felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about an affair. This was something far darker, more twisted. Jonathan had never truly been in love with her. He had married her out of necessity, out of convenience, to maintain the image of the perfect pastor, the perfect husband. But behind closed doors, he had been living a lie, using Emma as a pawn in his own twisted game. Emma's mind raced. She thought about all the moments she had questioned herself, doubted her instincts, all the times she had felt something was wrong but ignored it, trusting Jonathan instead. She had ignored her gut, dismissed the growing discomfort, all because she believed in their love, their bond. But now that bond was shattered, irreparably broken. Emma felt sick, a wave of nausea rolling through her as she replayed the footage in her mind. She had been violated, her body, her trust, her very identity. Nothing she thought was real remained. Jonathan's calm reassurances, his gentle touch, his endless promises, they were all part of the lie, a carefully crafted deception to keep her in the dark. Tears streamed down Emma's face as the enormity of the betrayal settled in. Her entire life had been a farce, built on a foundation of manipulation and lies. And now there was nothing left but rage, burning, seething rage. Emma clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white, as she tried to control the storm brewing inside her. She couldn't confront Jonathan, not yet. She needed to be smart, to understand just how deep this deception ran. She couldn't let him know what she had discovered, not until she had all the pieces, because when she did confront him, it wouldn't be with words, it would be with something far more final. The days that followed were a blur. Emma moved through the motions of her life like a ghost, numb to everything but the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Her mind, once filled with love and trust, was now consumed with questions and suspicions. Each time she looked at Jonathan, each time he flashed that familiar, calm smile, her stomach turned. How could she face him, knowing what she knew, knowing that the man she had married, the man she had devoted her life to, had been living a lie from the very beginning? Jonathan carried on, as if nothing had changed. He left for work each morning, attending to his duties at the church, leading sermons, comforting others. His life was a performance, a carefully curated image of a loving husband and devoted pastor. But Emma knew the truth now, and every smile, every gentle word felt like poison. She wanted to scream, to confront him, to force him to admit what he had done, but she knew that moment wasn't here yet. She needed more information, more proof. She needed to understand just how deep the darkness went. So Emma waited. She hid her rage behind a mask of indifference, pretending everything was fine, while inside she unraveled. But she wasn't idle. While Jonathan was at work, she installed more cameras. She planted them in the living room, in his study, anywhere he spent time alone. Emma needed to hear his conversations, to catch him when he thought no one was watching. She didn't have to wait long. One afternoon, while Jonathan was out at the church, Emma sat down to review the footage from the hidden cameras. She fast-forwarded through hours of nothing, Jonathan sitting quietly, reading, working, the perfect image of a man at peace. But then something caught her attention, a phone call. Emma paused the video, her heart pounding. She pressed play, listening carefully as Jonathan's voice filled the room. He was speaking in hushed tones, his back to the camera, pacing slowly as he talked. At first, it sounded like any other call, polite, measured. But then his tone shifted, becoming softer, more intimate, and then she heard it. The name, Lucas. Emma froze. Her blood ran cold as she realized who Jonathan was speaking to. Lucas, the man from the video, the one who had violated her while she lay unconscious. The man Jonathan had invited into their home. The conversation continued, Jonathan's voice low and almost apologetic. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "She's starting to ask questions." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, the room closing in around her. She leaned forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she strained to hear every word. "I've been drugging her like we talked about," Jonathan continued. "But I can't keep doing it forever. She's getting suspicious. I thought I could live this life, that I could be the man everyone expected me to be, but I can't. I miss you." Emma's hands shook as she listened to the confession. The man she had married wasn't just hiding an affair. He had never loved her. He had been using her to maintain his image, to protect his reputation as a man of the church, a man of God. But the truth was far darker. He had manipulated her, violated her trust, and turned their marriage into a twisted charade. Jonathan's voice cracked slightly as he spoke again. "I know I should never have gotten married, but I had to. I needed to prove I could be this person, for the church, for the community. But I can't keep pretending. It's tearing me apart. Emma's stomach twisted in knots as she realized the depth of his deception. He had never wanted her, never wanted a family, never wanted the life they had built together. It was all a lie, a facade to hide the fact that he was living a double life, hiding his true identity. She listened as Jonathan's voice softened even more, as though he was speaking to someone he truly loved. I'll figure it out. I'll find a way to end this. But if she finds out, if she knows what's really been happening... Emma didn't need to hear the rest. She turned off the video, her body trembling with rage. The truth was laid bare before her, and it was worse than anything she had imagined. Jonathan didn't just betray her, he destroyed everything they had. He had violated her body, her mind, her soul, and all for the sake of maintaining a lie. But now the truth was out. Emma knew everything. She had seen the video, heard the conversations, and the man she had once loved was nothing more than a stranger, a monster hiding behind a smile. The rage that had been simmering inside her finally erupted. She couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep waiting. The time for patience was over. Jonathan would pay for what he had done. The air in the house felt heavier now, thick with the weight of secrets and lies. Every step Emma took seemed to echo in the silence, her heart pounding in her chest, louder with every beat. She had reached her breaking point. The man she had trusted more than anyone had deceived her in ways she could never have imagined. He had stolen her life, twisted it into a lie, and now there was no going back. That night, Emma decided she couldn't wait any longer. The rage that had been simmering inside her for days now burned like wildfire, and she knew it would consume her if she didn't act. Jonathan had to pay, but not just with words. Words were no longer enough. The pain he had caused her demanded more. It demanded justice. It demanded retribution. Jonathan came home late, as he often did, walking through the front door with that same calm, collected smile on his face, the one that now made Emma's skin crawl. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, the same hollow affection he had shown for months. But this time, Emma didn't flinch. She played her part perfectly, smiling back at him, acting as if everything was normal. She had spent the day preparing. The wine was already on the table, a bottle of his favorite vintage. She had crushed the sleeping pills into his glass earlier, careful to leave no trace. She had practiced her words in her head a dozen times, making sure her voice would stay steady, calm, just like his had been all those times he lied to her. "Let's celebrate tonight," Emma said softly, her voice betraying none of the rage that boiled beneath the surface. "I feel like we've been distant, and I want to make things right." Jonathan smiled, clearly unaware of the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. He poured himself a glass of wine, oblivious to the danger lurking in every sip. "That sounds perfect," he said, his voice warm, as if nothing was wrong, as if their entire life wasn't built on a foundation of betrayal. They sat together, sipping their wine, talking about nothing, pretending everything was fine. But Emma's mind was elsewhere, calculating, waiting. She watched him closely, her eyes following the way his hand gripped the glass, the way his lips touched the rim. She waited for the moment his body would begin to fail him, when the sedatives would finally take effect. It didn't take long. Jonathan's speech began to slur, his eyelids growing heavy. He blinked several times, trying to shake off the sudden wave of exhaustion that was pulling him under. I don't feel so good," he muttered, his words slow and sluggish. His hand fumbled, nearly knocking over his glass. Emma remained silent, watching as his body sagged in the chair, his movements growing weaker, more uncoordinated. Within minutes, he was unconscious. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, her hands shaking as she dragged Jonathan's limp body toward the bedroom. He was heavier than she expected, but the adrenaline rushing through her veins made it easier. Her breathing was shallow, her mind focused on the task at hand. She had planned this moment carefully, and now it was happening. There was no turning back. In the dim light of their bedroom, Emma stood over Jonathan's unconscious body, her eyes cold and distant. The man lying before her was no longer the husband she once loved. He was the man who had destroyed her, the man who had stolen everything from her, her trust, her body, her life. And now he was nothing more than a vessel for her vengeance. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the kitchen knife she had brought with her earlier. The cold steel glinted in the soft light, its weight heavy in her grasp. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stared down at Jonathan's face, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. The man who had once promised her the world had left her with nothing but pain. The rage inside her finally erupted. "I trusted you," she whispered, her voice shaking with anger and grief. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Without waiting for an answer, because there would be none, Emma raised the knife and plunged it into Jonathan's chest. The blade sank deep into his flesh, a sickening sound filling the room as blood spilled across the sheets. Jonathan's body jerked violently, but he was too far gone to fight back, too drugged to understand what was happening. But it wasn't enough. The pain, the betrayal, it was too much for a single act of violence to quell. Emma pulled the knife out and stabbed him again and again, each thrust fueled by the months of deceit, the lies that had consumed her marriage. Blood splattered across her hands, her arms, her face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The rage had taken over, and in that moment she was no longer the woman who had loved him. She was something darker, something broken beyond repair. By the time she stopped, Jonathan was gone. His once calm, composed body was now a lifeless shell, drenched in blood. The man who had orchestrated her worst nightmare was dead. But Emma didn't feel relief. She didn't feel anything. Her hands, stained with blood, trembled at her sides as she stared down at what she had done. The bedroom, their bedroom, was now a scene of horror, the walls, the bed, the floor, all soaked in the evidence of her rage. She stood there for what felt like hours, her mind numb, her body frozen. There was no going back now. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The man she had once thought was her future was now gone, erased from her life, but with him, her innocence, her hope, her sense of self had vanished too. In the dead silence of the room, with only the faint sound of her own ragged breathing, Emma knew that the worst was yet to come. The blood had dried on her hands, but Emma couldn't bring herself to wash it off. Hours had passed since she had ended Jonathan's life, yet she remained frozen in the same spot, staring at the lifeless body of the man who had stolen everything from her. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with the weight of what she had done. Jonathan was dead, but Emma didn't feel the relief she thought would come. The rage that had driven her to this moment had faded, leaving only an emptiness she couldn't escape. What she had done was irreversible. Her life, just like Jonathan's, was now in ruins. But there was no time for hesitation. The shock was wearing off, and reality was crashing down on her. She had killed her husband. She had planned it, executed it, and now the evidence was splattered all over the room. She needed to act. She needed to cover her tracks before the world came crashing in. With trembling hands, Emma reached for the saw she had hidden earlier. Her stomach turned at the thought of what she was about to do. But there was no other option. Jonathan's body had to disappear. The mess she had created needed to be erased, just like the life they had shared. The hours blurred together as she worked, her mind detached from the horror of the task. The sound of bone breaking under the saw, the sickening squelch of flesh being torn apart. It was all too much, but she forced herself to keep going. Bag by bag, she packed the pieces of Jonathan's body into thick black trash bags. each one heavier than the last. When the task was finally done, Emma stood in the middle of the room, her body aching, her mind numb. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, was now reduced to nothing more than a collection of dismembered parts, stuffed into trash bags like garbage. But even as she stared at the gruesome scene before her, there was no satisfaction, only a cold, gnawing emptiness. She cleaned the room methodically, scrubbing away the blood, the evidence of her crime. The scent of bleach filled the air, stinging her nostrils and burning her eyes, but she didn't stop until every trace of Jonathan's existence had been wiped away. By the time she was done, the room looked almost normal. Almost. But there was one last thing, something she hadn't expected, something that hit her harder than anything else. A few days after the murder, as Emma tried to piece her life back together, she began to feel different. Exhausted, nauseous, her body betraying her in ways she couldn't explain. At first, she thought it was the stress, the weight of what she had done catching up with her. But then, the truth came crashing down. She was pregnant. The revelation knocked the air from her lungs. It was as if the world had shifted beneath her feet, and she was free-falling into an abyss she hadn't seen coming. The life growing inside her wasn't Jonathan's, not really. It was the result of the man he had let violate her, the man she had never even known. The horror of it all came crashing down on her in waves, threatening to drown her. Emma's body trembled as she stood in front of the mirror, her hands instinctively moving to her stomach. She had spent months wondering why she hadn't gotten pregnant, hoping for a child to fill the emptiness in her marriage. And now, in the aftermath of the most brutal decision she had ever made, she carried the ultimate reminder of Jonathan's betrayal. She couldn't escape it. The life growing inside her was the product of everything Jonathan had done to her, the lies, the manipulation, the violation. And yet, she was responsible for it now. A child that was hers, but also a constant reminder of the man she had murdered and the twisted reality of her life. But there was no time to dwell on the pregnancy. The world was closing in, the police were getting closer, days turned into weeks, and Emma's paranoia grew. She had disposed of Jonathan's remains, scattering the bags across the city in dumpsters, alleyways, places no one would look. But she knew it wouldn't last forever. Secrets like hers didn't stay buried. One cold morning, as she sat in her small apartment, the knock on the door finally came. Her heart stopped. She had known this day would come, but it didn't make it any less terrifying. The police stood on the other side, their expressions grim as they informed her that one of the bags had been found. Bones, a hand, enough to identify the remains as Jonathan's. Emma didn't resist, she didn't cry. She simply allowed herself to be led away in handcuffs, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a stone. She had already lost everything. There was nothing left to fight for. Not even the child growing inside her could save her now. The trial was a spectacle, the media devouring every detail of the gruesome murder and the dark secrets that had led to it. Emma's story became national news. The betrayed wife who had taken her revenge in the most brutal way imaginable. Her defense team tried to paint her as a victim, driven to madness by Jonathan's lies and betrayal. But it wasn't enough. The prosecution was relentless, showing the jury the video footage of Jonathan drugging Emma, the evidence of the other man, the betrayal that had destroyed her. But they also showed the aftermath, the dismembered body, the meticulous cover-up. Emma had planned it. She had executed it. And for that, there would be no mercy. Emma was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The child she carried, born just weeks after her arrest, was placed into foster care, a tragic reminder of the nightmare that had consumed her life. The man who had unknowingly violated her, believing the encounter to be consensual, was also found guilty of lesser charges. His sentence wasn't as severe as Emma's, But he too would pay for the role he had played in the twisted events that had unfolded in that house. And so Emma's story came to an end, not with justice, not with redemption, but with the cold reality of a life shattered by betrayal, violence, and a darkness she could never have imagined. In the end, there were no winners, only victims of a secret too dark to remain hidden.